कभी करती हैं मुलाकातें, कभी करती हैं मुलाकातें, कभी यादों में बरसातें, किताबें करती हैं बातें, किताबें करती हैं बातें। मन की गहरी झील में कूद जाती हैं कभी, सोच के दरिया के संग संग बहती जाती हैं कभी। चाहे शाम हो या हो रातें, किताबें करती हैं बातें।
Hello there and welcome to this special episode of Kitaabnama. I'm Namita Gokhale in conversation with the phenomenal best-selling author Yung Chang, the author of Wild Swans, and we're talking about how you're coming up on a quarter century now of this this book.
Yes. Well, I mean, it's amazing how time flies. Wild Swans is the story of my grandmother, my mother, and myself. The story of 3 generations of Chinese women and in the 20th century.
Did it ever surprise you that it had such a resonance, outside of China, and in fact, the world at large?
Well, when I wrote the story, obviously I wasn't thinking about the kind of the success, shall we say, throughout the world. In fact, it started with my mother telling me the stories of her life and the stories of my grandmother. And when I was listening to my mother, I was struck by how my mother wanted me, her daughter, to understand her. And I thought I've got to write all these stories down. And that's how I started writing Wild Swans. When the book was finished, and it was before publication, and my mother wrote me and said, the book might not do well and people might not pay attention to it, but I was not to worry because she could see that writing the book had brought us closer together, and I had loved her more now, and she said I'd made her a happy woman. So basically it was a family story, but then of course it's wonderful that tens of millions of people all over the world feel that they can identify with the story.
Absolutely. I read this actually in college, and it just grips you. And I was talking about the reaction in China, but in fact your book is still banned in China.
Yes, well, very sadly, unfortunately, my book Wild Swans and my other books, a biography of Mao and a biography of Empress Dowager Cixi, are all banned in China. And the problem with China is that there is a party line on history. And my books don't toe that party line. And so they are banned.
Have you been able to get a sense, though, from people relatives and friends in China, or who've left China even, how they felt when they read this book? Because it must have been quite a phenomenon for them as well.
Well, yes, I mean, once I was talking to a friend and her daughter. This was some years ago now, and the daughter of my friend said, when we were talking about the famine, the Great Famine, right, between 1958 and 1961, some 40 million people died of starvation and overwork as a result of Mao's policies. And my friend's daughter said, famine, what do you mean by the famine? She never heard of it. It's not in school textbooks. And so my friend said, oh, how do I explain? Now you can go and read Wild Swans.
So she had to get it somehow. Otherwise?
Well, because a lot of Chinese are traveling abroad now. They're educated abroad, or Chinese tourists go to Hong Kong and Taiwan, where my books in Chinese are published. In China, a lot of tourists go abroad to buy banned books.
Interesting. So that's an industry in itself, almost, you could say. Yes. But I do want to ask you a little bit about your personal history, because before you came to England, and we learned that, in fact, Yung Chang was the first a person from communist China to receive a doctorate from a British university. So that's a huge, it's almost like a culture shock, would you say?
Well, yes. When I left China in 1978, I was one of the first group of 14 people to go and study in Britain, because China was just beginning to open up after Mao's death in 1976. And before then, the country was completely closed, and we all sort of lived in complete isolation.
Right.
In fact, when I learned English, you know, even our English language teachers, this is in China, had never met foreigners before. And so our textbooks were direct translations of Chinese texts. So the lesson greetings was a direct translation from Chinese text. And because in China in those days, when we bumped into each other, we said, 吃饭了吗？上哪儿去? Which means, where are you going? And have you eaten? So those were the English greetings I learned. So when I first arrived in Britain, I used to go around and ask people where they were going and whether they had eaten.
And sort of lovely. They must be taking a lot of interest in their in their well-being.
Yes, well, it was just such an exciting time when I arrived in Britain. I mean, it was like landing on Mars. And then I got a scholarship from York University of York in England, and I went to do a doctorate in linguistics. So when I got my doctorate in 1982, I was so lucky. I became the first person from communist China to get a doctorate from a British university. I was extremely lucky because at that time people were just beginning to get out of China.
And things were opening up and the sort of change. Before we just move on a little bit, I want to ask you about your life before that, because I was just reading about during the Cultural Revolution, you've worked as a peasant, a barefoot doctor, an electrician, a steel worker. Take us through a little bit about that.
Well, I mean, in the Cultural Revolution, my generation were all exiled were sent to the villages. And I was exiled to the edge of the Himalayas and worked as a peasant and then as a barefoot doctor. A barefoot doctor was a doctor without any training, because Mao had said, the more books you read, the more stupid you become. And that became the guideline for health and education. Which was really meant a peasant doctor. And then I became a steel worker and an electrician. Again, there was no training, so I had 5 electric shocks in 1 month. and then in 1973, when things improved, when China became more relaxed, universities began to reopen. So I was able to get into Sichuan University to learn English, and that's how I started learning English. But of course, the country was still completely closed, Sichuan in particular, and so the only foreigners I saw before I left China in 1978 were some sailors in South China, where we were sent to practice our English.
Oh, interesting. But in a way, because the timing has been also very lucky, you're saying. You know, you're lucky at the time that, Mao had passed away. And do you feel now, though, living in London, in England, that are you sometimes asked to be a sort of interpreter? Because it's a culture that a lot of people want to understand in the West, and especially now.
Well, I feel that my books tell the stories of China and China in the 20th century. I myself am not a pundit, so I always decline invitation to comment on current affairs. I don't live in China, so I don't have that feel which only people who live there have. So since the publication of Wild Swans, I stopped commenting on China.
On present-day China.
On present
so let's
China.
talk about your other books. And you've written this book on Mao that you were talking about, and you're also fascinated by the Empress Dowager Cixi.
Yes.
Would you tell us a little bit about that story?
Okay. Mao, I wrote the biography of Mao with my husband, John Halliday, and we both were fascinated by him, and we both had many unanswered questions. I grew up under Mao, so I wanted to understand Mao, and writing a biography was obviously the way to find out. And so after the publication of Wild Swans, we got together and wrote this biography. We traveled all around the world and interviewed, everybody who had interesting dealings with Mao, like George Bush the Senior, Henry Kissinger. We came here, we went to Dharamsala and interviewed the Dalai Lama, and we interviewed the people close to Nehru. Because Nehru had this relationship with Mao and Zhou Enlai, who was Mao's kind of right-hand man, and so we divided our research also by language, because I'm Chinese, so I dealt with the Chinese language sources. And John, my husband, unfortunately speaks many languages, so he was landed with the rest of the world. And in particular, he speaks Russian, and he spent years working in the Russian archives, which turned out to be a treasure trove.
Oh, good. Okay, so that worked out
and
well.
I also interviewed, people close to Mao, including his girlfriends, his family and staff, and most of them talked for the first time. We were very lucky. We caught a window of opening in the 1990s.
And that's another book that's banned.
That's another. Mao's in particular
can't.
Banned, because we came to the conclusion that Mao was responsible for the death of well over 70 million Chinese in peacetime. But of course, today, Mao's portrait is still on Tiananmen, his corpse in the middle of Chinese capital, his face is on every Chinese banknote, so our Mao biography was really seriously, fiercely banned.
I just have one final question for you, as we're completely out of time though. How have you reacted to social media? Are you on Twitter, Facebook? Do you interact with your readers in that sense?
No, I feel somehow that probably would take a lot of time.
Yeah.
I mean, I just don't have the time, and I don't have that much to say on an everyday basis.
Do they meet you sort of at book readings and tours? That's where, because you said you were in India earlier as well with your Mao book.
Yes, I researched Mao book in India, and I also came to literary festivals in India. I love being in India, so I get all opportunities to come here.
Yeah, and to interface with your fans here, which is great.
I had a lot of people, not fans, let's say, but I also noticed that India had a lot of pro-Mao people, particularly a few years back, and once I gave a talk in the India International Center. I think there were more people. There were quite a lot of people who were sort of, if I may say, apologists for Mao.
How interesting. We'll have to leave it on that note. But Yung Chang, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for watching Kitaabnama.
Shivani was a bundle of nerves that seemed to become more and more knotted with each passing hour. She was exhausted, irritable, and snapped at everyone. That is to say, at Manasa and Jayadev, the only two human beings that she regularly saw day after day, week upon week. She listened to the radio and to the life in her stomach. She felt ugly. She walked on the beach, continually telling herself, "You are guilty, stupid, and insane for having agreed to have a baby clandestinely." She realized that there was nothing more sapping than a hole and corner existence like hers, than a life lived clandestinely. Her stomach was already enormous and growing bigger every day. She would produce a giant, and then what if he turned out to be not all there? Her knees and lower back ached. All day she felt hungry and wanted to vomit at the same time. Jayadev's patience and undying good humor, the amiability of the slightly retarded, enervated her beyond bearing. It was only to crack the shell of his good cheer that she snapped at him one afternoon that the baby, when born, was to be handed over to Manasa and Pashupati. But it is my child. Yes, of course, but I promised. Jayadev became glum and tongue-tied. He stopped massaging her, making love to her, crooning his risque folk songs, calming her by his mere presence. He stopped eating and moped instead. After 2 days of his sulking, she snapped at him one evening, "Oh, please go away." He did. He disappeared. She woke up the next morning to find herself alone and the front door open a couple of centimeters. That unnerved her the most and recurred in her uneasy sleep, a grey door revealing a chink of tube-lit foyer. For an entire day she couldn't even shut the door for fear that if she touched it, he would not find the means of return. She shuffled in a daze from room to room, panting ever so slightly, stealing glances at the slightly open grey door, repeatedly reminding herself that she needed to focus on something important, but she couldn't remember.
And I'm going to read a passage from a story in this collection, The Quantity Theory of Insanity, that was published in 1991, so nearly 25 years ago. And this, the opening story from the book, is called The North London Book of the Dead. And it's about the narrator meeting his dead mother in the street. And the inspiration for the story, and in many ways, the spur to my own literary career, was the death of my own mother when I was 26, shortly before I wrote this story. The North London Book of the Dead. I suppose that the form my bereavement took after my mother died was fairly conventional. Initially I was shocked. Her final illness was mercifully quick, but harrowing. Cancer tore through her body as if it were late for an important meeting with a lot of other successful diseases. I had always expected my mother to outlive me. I saw myself becoming a neutered bachelor who would be wearing a cardigan and still living at home at the age of 40. But it wasn't to be. Mother's death was a kind of relief, but it was also bizarre and hallucinatory. The week she lay dying in the hospital, I was plagued by strange sensations. Gusts of air would seem personalized, and driving in my car, I had the sensation not that I was moving forward, but that the road was being reeled back beneath the wheels, as if I were mounted on some giant piece of scenery. The night she died, my brother and I were at the hospital. We took it in turns to snatch sleep in a vestibule at the end of the ward, and then to sit with her. She breathed stertorously. Her flesh yellowed and yellowed. I was quite conscious that she had no mind anymore. The cancer, or so the consultant told me, had made its way up through the meningitic fluid in the spine and into her brain. I sensed the cancer in her skull like a cloud of inky pus. Her self-consciousness, sentience, identity, what you will, was cornered, forced back by the cloud into a confined space where it pulsed on and then off with all the apparent humanity of a digital watch. 1 minute she was alive, the next she was dead. A dumpy nurse rushed to find my brother and me. We had both fallen asleep in the vestibule, cocooned within its plastic walls. "I think she's gone," said the nurse, and I pictured Mother striding down Gower Street, naked, wattled. By the time we reached the room, they were laying her out. I had never understood what this meant before. Now I could see that the truth was that the body, the corpse, really laid itself out. It was smoothed as if a great wind had rolled over the tired flesh. And it, Mother, was changing colour as I watched from an old ivory to a luminous yellow. The nurse, for some strange reason, had brushed Mother's hair back off her forehead. It lay around her brow in a fan on the pillow, and 2 lightning streaks of grey ran up into it from either temple. The nurses had long since removed her dentures, and the whole ensemble, Mother with drawn-in cheeks and sculpted visage, lying in the small room, around her the loops and skeins of a life-supporting technology, made me think of the queen of an alien planet, resplendent on a high-tech palanquin in some Buck Rogers-style sci-fi serial of the 30s. There was a great whooshing sensation in the room. This persisted as a doctor of Chinese extraction, long, yellow, and divided at the root, felt around inside her cotton nightie for a non-existent heartbeat. The back, spindly hairs on his chin wavered. He pronounced her dead. The whooshing stopped. I felt her spirit fly out into the orange light of central London. It was about 3 a.m.